in part in response to the disturbing number of self-inflicted deaths in prison, there are a wide-ranging number of suicide prevention measures, in particular something called the ACT document, which is a document that anybody who works in a prison can open, warning of somebody's risk of self-harm or suicide. And within that document there are a range of observations and suggestions of managing a person at risk through a care plan. So there are many guidelines for looking after people at risk of suicide and self-harm. The problem is that too often, although the guidance is clear and very good, it's a question of the suicide prevention guidelines not being implemented within prisons. Yes, what happens when somebody dies in prison is that there is an independent investigation which is carried out by the Prisons and Probation Ombudsman. So that will be carried out by an investigator. What we try and ensure is that the families of those who die in prison are properly supported from the outset, and we try and arrange them a good specialist legal aid lawyer to assist them through the investigation and inquest process, because part of that investigation should include effective involvement of the family, because very often the family have some very important information to share, but also many concerns about the treatment and care of their relative whilst in prison. So their contribution is extremely important, and we try and ensure that they can play a part and ensure that the questions they have about the death and their concerns are properly investigated. I think one of the concerns we have, I mean, if we're talking about prison deaths, you will, thankfully, restraint-related deaths in prison are rare. There have been a number of very disturbing restraint-related deaths where staff had restrained somebody and they've died as a direct result, and there's never been a prosecution of any of those. I think one of the concerns we have, particularly about deaths in prison, though, is around the prosecution for corporate manslaughter, which is where there has been a serious risk identified but no action has been taken to deal with that. And I think it does raise concerns about the accountability both of the prison service and senior management, and of course ministers and justice secretaries who've too often presided over very unsafe conditions and negligent treatment within prisons. And we have to question whether or not we have a system that is sufficiently accountable, and I suggest that we don't at the moment. And whilst it's very important that we have independent investigations and inquests, what concerns me is that inquests see the same issues of concern repeating themselves time and time again. And to me that suggests that we have an accountability gap, because we have inquests and coroners making reports to prevent future deaths, only to see that action isn't taken and for prisoners to die in almost identical circumstances, which raises questions about why it is that the system doesn't properly hold people to account, either through criminal prosecutions or for where we're talking about private companies, about whether or not profit is a motive that undermines the safety of people in detention. I think that's probably too simplistic, but if we use the recent example of the report into Rainsbrook Child Prison, Rainsbrook Secure Training Centre, which is a G4S run youth prison, I saw that report yesterday and I was absolutely disgusted by the evidence within that, because back in 2004 I worked with the family of a 15-year-old boy who died in Rainsbrook as a direct result of the restraint used against him by 3 G4S guards. And what that inquest exposed was the most appalling routine use of restraint, unlawful restraint and dangerous restraint, and a culture whereby restraint was just part of the everyday lives of those very vulnerable children. And to read a report that's talking about ongoing abuses and concerns about staff treatment, and in particular I have concerns about the monitoring role of the Youth Justice Board, who are supposed to be the eyes and ears of what is happening on the ground. And it was deeply upsetting to read that report, but also I think it made me particularly angry, because I think it points to, one, that we should stop locking up children in these kind of prisons, and two, that it is totally unacceptable that a private company is making money out of locking up some of society's most vulnerable children. And this report only exposes just the shameful way in which we're treating those young people. And anybody who reads that report, I think, would be suitably appalled by what we're doing, and how profit clearly is undermining any proper rehabilitative therapeutic support for these children. The most effective suicide prevention is clearly to stop sending so many people to prison. We have prisons that are bursting at the seams. We have highly limited regimes and conditions which do absolutely nothing to rehabilitate people. If anything, it just reproduces criminal behaviour, and I think makes people physically and mentally unwell, even if they weren't before they even arrived there. And we know about the high levels of mental ill health amongst prisoners. So I think we absolutely need to recognise that prison is an extremely expensive option. It fails, as demonstrated by the number of people who end up going back, but also that it's increasingly used as a default for failings in health, welfare, social agencies. And too many of the people in prison, of course, are the most powerless, the most marginalised, the poorest. And at a time of austerity, my concern is we're going to see more people entering the criminal justice system. And what we need to do is use the money that we're putting into the criminal justice system, into the prison system, and reinvest and reallocate that into community-based alternatives that can better address some of the reasons why people end up in prison in the first place, but actually help people move on and stay out of the criminal justice system. And these are important challenges for the new administration, but ones that, my fear is that if we don't do something very quickly, we're just going to see an ongoing litany of deaths, many of which point to serious failings at lots of different levels. And of course we also have to start with the courts, because we have a situation where the courts send far too many people to prison, and they need also to be held accountable.